Good morning, everyone. My name is Johannes Urpelainen, and I am the Principal Abdulaziz Professor of Energy Resources and Environment and the founding director of the Initiative for Sustainable Energy Policy, or ISEP. I'm just going to give it a few minutes. We'll let people trickle in, and in another 2 to 3 minutes, I'm going to open the presentation after introducing our speaker, Professor Blankenship, today. Okay, why don't we get started? Good morning again. I'm Johannes Urpelainen, Prince Sultan bin Abdulaziz Professor of Energy Resources and Environment at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and the founding director of the Initiative for Sustainable Energy Policy. Today's webinar is on a very important topic of a just transition. We're going to discuss these issues of livelihoods, job creation in a world where the COVID-19 has created serious economic problems, and we really need to rethink some key aspects of the global economy. And from our perspective, of course, the energy sector as a kind of key focus here. I'm going to introduce our speaker, Professor Blankenship. He's going to give a presentation of approximately 30 minutes. And then after that, we're gonna have a Q&A. If at any time you have a question for us, please use the Q&A function. I will keep track and moderate these discussions, and we will have Professor Blankenship respond to the questions after the presentation. In the meantime, I'll just remind you that if you're interested in similar events in the future, please do check out our website, size-isep.org. You can find all of our events and other activities, research products on that website. With that, I'd like to introduce Professor Blankenship from the University of Miami, Department of Political Science, who has done some really interesting work on this challenge of just transition, both globally, but with a particular focus on India, where the coal mining communities, which support somewhere between 25 to 30 million people, are really facing this challenge of what's going to happen moving forward to their primary source of income and livelihood. So Professor Blankenship, please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you for that, Johannes. So as Johannes mentioned, my name is Brian Blankenship. I'm an assistant professor in the political science department at the University of Miami. So as Johannes mentioned, today I'm going to be doing my best impression of a politician, because today it's all about jobs, jobs, jobs. Specifically, we're going to be talking quite a bit the concept of the just transition, specifically in the context of the fossil fuel economy, and talking about some of the challenges that the otherwise quite desirable transition toward renewable energy poses for those who depend on the fossil fuel industry for their livelihoods, and talking a bit about what the coronavirus could also mean for that. So just as sort of a brief outline of today's webinar. So I'm going to start off by talking a bit about sort of the more recent developments, particularly obviously the key one here is the coronavirus and the jobs crisis that has created. I'll then be talking a bit about the concept of just transition, what that means, and what sort of elements are part of that. I'll then be talking a bit about some of the research that I, in tandem with Johannes and others, have been doing in the state of Jharkhand in India. And finally, concluding with some policy implications and sort of broader implications for thinking about the response to COVID-19. So, as you've doubtless been seeing in the news, we are globally, but in the U.S. as well, facing a jobs crisis of more or less unprecedented magnitude. Really, not since the peak of the Great Depression in the 1930s have we seen unemployment rise to the levels that we're seeing right now. So just since March, we've seen over 30 million people in the U.S. file for unemployment. The official unemployment rate that came out last week said 14.7%, but it's estimated to be quite a bit higher than that. And there's very little reason to think that these numbers won't remain quite similar, if not increase over the coming months, notwithstanding any opening of the economy. And indeed, when you look historically, these numbers are really literally off the charts. Really, not since the early 1930s have we seen unemployment claims rise quite this precipitously. Really, even in the early days of the Great Depression, didn't rise quite this quickly, this much. And so in this webinar, I'm going to be thinking about this sort of jobs crisis in the context of what's often called the just transition. Now, the just transition is a concept that largely comes from the field of energy and environmental policy, and largely stems from the fact that the world is undergoing an energy transition. So over the past several decades, the cost of renewable energy has plummeted, and meanwhile the share of renewable energy in the global energy supply has skyrocketed. Still a long way to go, but it's increased a lot from what it was, and this is, for all intents and purposes, quite desirable for a variety of reasons. But what it means, unfortunately, is that we're going to be seeing employment opportunities in the fossil fuel industries begin to decline, both in terms of raw numbers. So people who are currently employed, may not be able to remain employed. And also jobs that would have otherwise existed, new jobs that would have otherwise existed in the future, won't be there necessarily for those who might have otherwise taken them. And so, there's been a lot of talk over the past 10 years or so about how to navigate this transition in a way that doesn't adversely affect those who are the most vulnerable, particularly those who depend on employment in fossil fuel industries for their livelihoods. And I think there are a couple of reasons to think about the COVID jobs crisis and the just transition at the same time. And the first is that they share some underlying similarities. So in both cases, right? So in both the COVID-19 jobs crisis and the sort of slow-moving jobs crisis of the renewable energy transition, the job losses that occur aren't really through any fault of the workers themselves, right? But instead are the result of necessary processes, right? So in COVID-19, social distancing. In the case of the renewable energy transition, decarbonization. The just that in one way or another have to happen if we're to avert really negative consequences, right? So if we hope to stop COVID-19 from ripping through the population, and if we hope to avert the worst possible consequences of climate change, these transitions are more or less inevitable. But at the same time, they're not the fault of those who are actually the most vulnerable to these transitions. And so it's worth thinking about. It's worth thinking about the two in a lot of the same ways when we think about the most appropriate ways to respond. Second, and in many ways most directly for the purposes of this webinar, is that there are policy responses that can help address both problems simultaneously, right? So the COVID-19 jobs crisis is one that has occurred over a very rapid time scale, whereas the transition to fossil away from fossil fuel that is occurring and will continue to occur a bit more gradually. And so one of the cases I'm going to be making is that the jobs crisis effectively an opportunity to, in many ways, help promote a just transition from fossil fuels, right? And so in particular, there are a variety of ways in which investments in alternative livelihoods as part of a just transition could help cushion COVID-19's economic consequences. And this could potentially include, but would by no means be limited to, jobs in the renewables industries. And so in many ways, as in the case of most crises, it's simultaneously a challenge, but also an opportunity. It's an opportunity to sort of take the transition and really run with it if we navigate it correctly. Now, I want to say a few words about what the just transition is, and in many ways, the most logical place to start is on the topic of climate change. So there was a well-publicized report put out by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a couple of years ago, which argued that one of the things that argued was that if we hope to keep the global rise in temperature below 1.5 degrees Celsius, which was the more ambitious target under the Paris Agreement, then the share of fossil fuels will have to decline precipitously. For example, will have to decline by 83% as a percentage of total global primary energy supply. And this is a challenge, but fortunately, we are in the midst of an energy transition, right? So as I alluded to earlier in the webinar, there are a couple of changes that are happening simultaneously. One is that the cost of renewable energy, and in particular solar, has really declined quite precipitously. So compared to even 10 years ago, the cost of solar power is now a fraction of what it was. And in a lot of cases, renewable sources of energy like solar and wind are actually cheaper than their fossil fuel equivalents. It's in many cases just simply more economical to use solar and wind power. Moreover, the share of renewable energy in as a percentage of energy used for electricity has also been skyrocketing. Right, it still has a long way to go, but the trend is very much upward. And given the comparative cheapness of renewables, one can only expect that to keep rising. So now this is in many ways this is good news, right? If we hope to avert climate change, then this is exactly the sort of change that needs to be happening. Now, the problem, though, is that this doesn't just mean that this isn't all good news, right? In many ways, it's on net, of course, good news, but there are some challenges along the way. And in many ways, the main one, and the one that I want to focus on today, is that essentially what this means is that there are going to be fewer job opportunities in the fossil fuel industry in the coming decades. The International Labor Organization, for example, estimates that over the next 10 years, the total number of jobs offered by the fossil fuel industry is likely to decline by about 6 million. And so, a natural question arises as to what do we do, right? Because this transition presents a lot of challenges. In many ways, there's of course the moral challenge and the economic challenge, but when it comes to climate change in particular, it also presents a political challenge, right? So because the fact that you're going to have entire industries essentially contracting, and many of which are quite concentrated by region, it's going to mean that there's going to be some pushback to the renewables transition. And one can, for example, expect that those who may be negatively affected by the transition, for example, coal miners, aren't going to go out without a fight. And especially because these jobs are often so heavily concentrated by region, what this could mean is that as employment opportunities in oil or in coal mining, as those dry up, then what that could mean is that entire regions and communities that really depended on these industries for their livelihoods could essentially lose their primary source of livelihoods. And a good example of this, one that's often discussed, is something like the Rust Belt in the U.S., right, where you had a pretty large region surrounding the Great Lakes from Wisconsin all the way into Pennsylvania, that really depended on industrial jobs really depended on industrial jobs for their livelihoods, and when these jobs disappeared, there wasn't a whole lot to fill the void, at least not immediately. And so what you had was sort of entire communities that were affected, as opposed to just a few workers here, a few workers there. And so what all this means is that if we want the renewable energy transition to happen smoothly, as in many ways we should, uh, then it's important to make sure that we cushion the negative impacts of this transition on the populations who are likely to be most negatively affected, right? Because if we want to implement policies to push forward the renewable energy transition and deal with the problem of climate change, that it's important that we essentially make sure that those who stand to lose from this transition are adequately compensated and made whole. Now, when it comes to what this actually means in practice, so there's been a lot of work over the past 10 years or so on the subject of a just transition from fossil fuels, and a lot of the work is still very much in its early stages, but generally speaking, there's a consensus that the just transition should include several things for communities affected by the transition. And the first, and in many ways the most obvious one, is just to create new jobs, right? To give communities an alternative to employment in fossil fuel industries. In many ways, the most natural candidate for this would be the renewable industries, but that by no means are those the only potential candidates, right? You can imagine any number of alternative jobs, right? In some sense, what matters less is the job itself, and more sort of, how does it pay, how safe is it, how far is it, that sort of thing. But renewables are in many ways a natural candidate here. And likewise, if you're going to create new jobs, you also have to provide opportunities to train workers for these jobs, right? So if we want, for example, coal miners to be able to navigate the transition, it's likely that they'll need to be retrained so that they can take advantage of these new opportunities. And the final couple of elements of the just transition that a lot of activists and scholars have pointed to is the need to provide a social safety net to those who are affected, right? So some people just simply might not be able to find new jobs in a very timely fashion, and so it's important that they be adequately compensated. And finally, it's important that in many ways, one of the nicest things about the renewable energy transition is that energy is going to become available relatively cheaply, and so it's important that those who are affected actually are able to get cheap energy access. And so with that background in mind, I now want to turn to talk a bit about some of the research that I and that I've been doing with ISEP on the issue of just transition, particularly in the state of Jharkhand in India. So just a bit of background. So we at ISEP have been doing research in Jharkhand for about the last year and a half now. And in particular, we've been interested in what a transition away from coal might look like for the state. So Jharkhand is located in what's often called India's coal belt, and much like many of its neighbors, Jharkhand has a large number of coal reserves, and produces a lot of coal. In fact, it has the largest coal reserves in the country. And so the India state-owned coal company directly employs roughly 90,000 workers, though the actual number of workers who depend on the coal industry for their livelihood is much, much higher. That number only includes those who are directly employed. And a lot of these jobs are heavily concentrated in a few areas of the state. So the coal industry is largely concentrated around sort of the what's often referred to as the coal belt, which kind of sweeps from west to east across the state. And so, in many ways, Jharkhand is a natural candidate for a state that's going to be affected by the renewable energy transition. And so, what we did was so last summer, just under a year ago now, we at ISEP conducted a survey of rural households in the state that was across all 24 districts of the state, and was representative of the rural population in the state. And basically, this survey had a few elements to it. One was that it tried to get a sense of the energy access picture in the state. The second was to get an overall picture of how dependent the rural communities were on the coal industry and their perception of the coal industry. And finally, and most directly for this webinar, was to get a sense of job preferences, in particular preferences between working in coal mining versus working in a number of other livelihoods. And so, for my purposes today, the research that we did had kind of two underlying questions. And the first of these was how willing workers were to take jobs in or outside the fossil fuel industry. And the second, and relatedly, was what types of characteristics sort of shaped that choice, right? So what characteristics of jobs were seen as the most important in shaping people's choices between jobs. And so this survey was 1,440 households with 10 respondents per village across 144 villages. And in each survey, we essentially we included what's known as a conjoint experiment, in which essentially respondents were presented with two jobs, one of which was always a coal miner, and the other of which was either a solar energy worker, a street vendor, or a farmer. And the characteristics of each job were randomized, so that randomized along how far they were from respondents' homes, how safe they were, how much they paid. And this was repeated 4 times per respondent. And so basically, we were interested in seeing both how often people chose the coal mining job, and also what job characteristics were regarded as the most important. And so this is a map of the of Jharkhand, and so the black dots here are the villages we sampled. Meanwhile, the red dot here is the capital city of Ranchi. The yellow are coal fields, while the blue dots are the coal field centroids. And so we sampled based on distance to the coal fields, mainly in order to make sure that we got enough respondents that were actually near coal fields, that we could get a sense of, so we could get enough of them in the sample. And so I just wanted to very quickly run through the findings. So so this is a coefficient plot of what we found in the survey. So basically, so uh, the um, the bars that are to the right of the dashed line show that respondents were more likely to choose a job, and those to the left show that respondents were less likely to choose a job. So, as one might expect, respondents were more likely to choose a job that employed them for longer periods of time. And they were also more likely to choose jobs that paid more and were safer for their health. And likewise, they were less likely to choose jobs that were further away from their home, ranging from 1 kilometer to 50 kilometers. And now, one thing that that was quite interesting, and that we actually didn't go in necessarily expecting, was that respondents really showed a strong aversion to choosing the coal mining job, right? So in virtually in most cases, respondents were much less likely to choose the coal miner job than one of the other jobs, by roughly a difference of about 35 percentage points. And so, this was not a finding that we necessarily went in expecting, and so we decided to probe a bit more closely to see, what was driving this. And I won't get into the full findings today, but happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. And so, what we also found was that that respondents were much less likely to choose the coal mining job the further they were from a coal mine, right? So once you get, for respondents who were more than 50, 75 kilometers away from a coal mine, basically less than 10% likely to choose the coal mining job. And so there was really a very dramatic effect here of distance, right? So the further you are from the coal industry, the less you care to take a coal mining job. And the same pattern held for whether or not respondents actually knew anyone in the coal industry. So we went in expecting that respondents who actually knew someone that worked in the coal industry might be more favorably inclined to taking a coal mining job. And that's indeed what we found, though even here, people who did know someone in the coal industry weren't terribly likely to choose a coal mining job, roughly about a 50-50 chance. But those who didn't know anyone, were basically below 30% likely to select it. And so basically, so there are a few sort of key findings that come from our research in Jharkhand. The first is that we find what we're calling evidence of a coal penalty, right? So, and what we mean by that is that the coal mining job was really seen as quite unattractive, and even for those who were close to the coal industry, but especially for those who were quite far from it, right? So those respondents who were far from a coal mine and who didn't know anyone that worked in the coal industry, basically, they were very, very unlikely to select the job. And the other key implications here are that we found were that basically the most important determinants of job choice were wages and safety. Meanwhile, distance wasn't quite as important. So it really, respondents were really relatively indifferent between jobs that were between 1 and 20 kilometers from their home. It was only once the job became really quite far away, upwards of 50 kilometers away, that respondents really started becoming averse to selecting a particular job. And so in terms of implications here, so one is that really, in many ways, this is the key implication here, is that from a public opinion perspective, it doesn't appear that opposition to the renewable energy transition is insurmountable, but rather that instead what the main barrier is to convincing people to shift away from the fossil fuel industry is simply the availability of alternative jobs, right? So there's no inherent aversion to, there's no inherent love for the coal job. In fact, quite the opposite. Second, and moreover, our findings imply that really, when it comes to creating alternative jobs, what should be prioritized is pay and safety, and distance wasn't quite as important. And what this implies is that job creation in more sort of central urban areas, may actually be viable alternatives for those in rural, for respondents and workers in rural areas. And so I know I'm running out of time, so I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I want to talk about some of the broader implications of this for thinking about the response to COVID-19. And now of course, the transition from fossil fuels and the jobs crisis created by COVID are quite different, and I wouldn't want to directly apply the lessons from one to the other. But in many ways, the core principle is the same: to help workers adapt in a rapidly changing world, so that necessary policies can be implemented. And so I want to take the last bit of time here to talk a bit about what the future might hold, and how the response to COVID might contribute to the just transition. And just in a general sense, the jobs crisis created by COVID is likely going to be with us for a while. And of course, this has both short-term and long-term implications. In the short term, some workers are going to be affected more than others, particularly if they are either in an industry where demand has collapsed, right? So if you are in the hotel industry, for example, or if you're seen as an essential worker, then if you're seen as an essential worker, then the priority here is going to be job safety. In the long term, of course, preparing those who lost their jobs and either lost income for a while or lost their job permanently, preparing them for the long-term effects of that is going to be quite essential. And so in the short term, you can think about sort of the adaptations to COVID-19 as sort of depending on sort of what sort of job you have, right? So if you are in a job where you can work remotely, then obviously you're better off. And if you're in a job where, if you're in an industry where demand hasn't plummeted, then you're also a bit better off. And so, depending on where workers fall along these two dimensions, the sorts of adaptations that need to be made on their behalf are going to vary, right? So if you're in an industry where you have to be there, you can't work remotely, then obviously job safety is going to be quite important in ensuring that you can maintain adequate social distancing. You can that working conditions are sanitary is going to be quite essential. Meanwhile, if you're in a job in an industry where demand is plummeted, then that job simply may not exist in the short term and even the long term. And so here, relief is going to be the most essential thing. And so I'll skip over this since I know I'm running out of time. But in the long term, now of course, as in the case of any crisis, it's simultaneously a challenge and an opportunity, right? So from the perspective of the COVID-19 jobs crisis, it's potentially an opportunity to promote alternative livelihoods, and in particular, this could include, but would not necessarily be limited to, jobs in the renewable energy industry. Already, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics estimates that the two fastest growing jobs of the next 10 years will be solar photovoltaic installers and wind turbine service technicians. And in many ways, the response to COVID-19 could push this forward. And so government stimulus efforts could prioritize efforts to build new jobs in order to promote a just transition. And so that's all for me. Thank you all for coming, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Wonderful, thank you, Brian, for this insightful presentation. So we have questions here. Let me just start with going through this kind of as I see them. So first of all, we have Rahul Tongia from India is asking about the kind of sectoral aspects here. So just transition is a challenge for India, and Rahul is asking, isn't employment a far bigger deal in agriculture, where there's simply too many people doing farming as opposed to coal? So what is your thinking of that?
Yeah, so so when it comes to yeah, I mean, I think that's a very valid point. Yeah, I mean, that's sort of I wouldn't argue with that, and I think that's a perfectly valid point. Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add to that, aside from just agreeing with the overall point.
Excellent. Okay. The next question is from Caroline Ashley, who's asking if job creation in central areas is a viable alternative for rural jobs. Aren't we compounding the issues that have meant that we are feeling COVID so great, like urbanization, increased density, transportation, and wouldn't this then create some sort of additional problems?
Yeah, so I think this is a good point, and this is in many ways an area where the response to COVID and the response to the just transition going to fall in line necessarily, right? So in the long term, urbanization and job creation have long been thought to run together, but I think that this is a good point, because in many ways it's difficult to imagine for the next couple of years that many people are going to necessarily want to move to the city, given all of the risks that could present in terms of exposure to COVID-19. Over the long term, I think the forecast is probably quite a bit better, but in the short run, I think that's exactly correct.
Okay, perfect. Next we have Esvara Chaitanya Duvuri is asking about just a simple question of how many days did it take to complete the survey for this research?
So yeah, so I believe we started it in I want to say we started it in early August of 2019, and it was finished by I believe it was mid-September, so it was about 45 days. I think is about right.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. And we have another question from Rahul Tongia here. And this is a very interesting one for us. So as Sandeep Pai notes in his research, if we replace one coal job, let's say with one renewable energy job, it could be in a very different area and a very different job, right? So what do you think are the implications of this fact for the just transition?
Yeah, I think this is a really important point, and it's yeah, and yeah, I like Sandeep Pai's work a lot. He has a really good paper out just in the past couple of months or so, showing that um, that in many cases the areas that are in which renewable jobs could be created are not necessarily the areas where fossil fuel workers are currently located. And I think it's for that reason that it's important to not put all the eggs in that basket, right? That it's not it's not that jobs in renewables aren't the be all and end all for for alternative livelihoods. And I think it's important to think about the broad menu of alternative options.
Okay, great. And we do have another question now from Mahua Mukherjee, who is asking about who should pay for the training of, let's say, these renewable energy installers. And she says, while we were preparing the World Bank rooftop solar project, it became quite a contentious issue about where the rooftop installers would find trained workers. The developers are unwilling to pay for the training since workers can leave to another company. So could you comment on this, this policy issue?
It's a good question. I mean, at the end of the day, it's going to depend in large part on the local context. At the end of the day, if you want to do sort of like a very broad scale retraining program, then it may come down to governments, right? So if you want a large scale retraining program, then that it may just there may be no viable alternative than for governments to pay for that.
Got it. Excellent. And we have another question from Ankita Kakar, who's asking about the channels funding this. So she's saying, to deal with the ailing economy, the Indian government is putting money in the hands of two entities, individuals and micro, small and medium-sized enterprises. If money has to flow into the renewable sector in the next 2 to 3 years, it would be through these channels. Are there enough companies in the micro, small, medium enterprise sector to push this agenda?
I admittedly don't necessarily know enough about that to give a good answer. It's something I'd be curious to learn more about, but it's not something that I don't think I know enough about to give a good answer to.
Okay, so I have one question for you also, Brian. So what is your thinking on the kind of opportunity for a just transition here in the United States? So how do you think, what kind of policies should the federal government or maybe state governments push to make this happen? I know they're right now really not doing it, they're maybe doing the opposite, but what would be your wish list for good policy here in the United States?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think in the U.S., we have, I think, a lot of untapped potential in the renewables industries, right? So, in my new adopted home of Florida, for example, it has long been, considering that it's called the Sunshine State, it hasn't had a whole lot of installed solar capacity, and it's starting to move in that direction now, but. Um, but yeah, I mean, I would say just in general, investments in renewables would be top of that list, and in addition to, um, when it comes to cushioning the effect uh, of the transition away from fossil fuels. Um, so right now, there are a lot of subsidies going to fossil fuel companies, and which there's some logic to that from a perspective of saving jobs, but it would be in many ways much more efficient to just give that money directly to workers rather than prop up the companies themselves, right? So just try to invest in those who are likely who are likely to be the most negatively affected, as opposed to the companies themselves.
Got it. Okay, very good. And we have another comment from Esvara Duvuri here, saying what Caroline said is true, especially with the rising number of COVID cases in urban rather than rural India. That's just a comment, so I guess there's no need for to respond here. And from Mariama Da, we have a question. So here's a question. The increase in renewables in India does not necessarily mean a phase out of coal due to energy demand requirements with growing population and living standards. So just taking a step back from the just transition into the energy transition more broadly, how realistic do you think this is? Like, how fast do you expect things to happen in India in the coal to renewables transition? The quick one? Is it a kind of a short, kind of a long, gradual transition? What is your thinking on this issue?
Yeah, it's a good question, because and I think the premise of this question is right, that I think it's easy to overstate the speed at which this transition will move, right? Because while renewables are indeed dramatically increasing as in their share of global energy portfolio, fossil fuels aren't going to just disappear, and so in a lot of cases, there will still be some jobs, for quite a while to come. It's just a question of how many, and indeed, it's possible that the number of jobs won't. The absolute number of jobs won't decrease that quickly in some areas, but I guess the general point would be that they won't. The number of jobs won't increase as quickly as they would have under a pure fossil fuel based energy portfolio, such that the number of fossil fuel jobs as a percentage of population will sort of gradually decline. And so I guess there's a distinction between the absolute number of jobs and the number of jobs as a percentage of population. But I think the premise of the question is exactly right.
Okay, perfect. So we got additional questions here. Let's keep going. So Anna Shirokova is asking about what should we do in areas where there are no renewable energy opportunities? So what if you are in an area where there just isn't really any kind of wind blowing or sun shining? What should be the approach there?
Yeah, it's a good question, and in many ways, these are the trickiest cases, because you can't necessarily just create new jobs out of thin air. And so I think they're yeah, in the sense that there's not like a one-to-one, like you can't just take people from the fossil fuel industry and move them to the renewable industry. Um, and so there, I think that the local context is going to be quite important, right? So if you know if if these fossil fuel workers are in an area, depending on the industries that are in the area, I think you'll need to have very tailored jobs retraining programs. I think coupled with I think very very generous social safety nets to to sort of prop them up as these jobs kind of slowly if not disappear, kind of level off and decline. And so, yeah, I think the answer is going to largely depend on the local context in a lot of ways. But it's a very good question, very tricky one.
Okay, great. And Mohua Mukherjee has a comment on the reverse urban migration in India. So many of these reverse migrants may not want to come back to the cities. So it could be an ideal moment to train and engage them in rural areas with government stimulus money. So any thought on this, based on the sort of challenges many of these migrants have faced? Is there an opportunity to try to sort of develop some of the rural areas now?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I know in some of my own work, sort of looking at rooftop solar in the state of Jharkhand, I know there's been a big push to in rural areas really focus on distributed renewables. In large part because, in a lot of rural areas, just the electricity demand and electricity usage isn't nearly as high as it is for, for especially commercial and industrial consumers and even urban households. And so, distributed renewables may be a viable alternative in rural areas to meet demand, and so there could be an opportunity for job creation in that front, right? When it comes to things like solar installers, that sort of thing.
Okay, wonderful. I think there's one more question from Caroline Ashley. She's asking about this opportunity that COVID-19 would provide for this just transition to come to the forefront. So what are your recommendations for businesses and governments who want to make this case? So how do you get attention to something like this, which is a little more medium-term, long-term, instead of putting out fires? So what is the strategy here?
It's a good question. In some sense, the recent the recent really plummeting in the price of oil has sort of forced a reckoning on the issue of what to do with these industries, right? And so there may be an opportunity there to sort of sell some the general point that look, these may be industries that are going to be very hard hit by COVID in the short term, medium term. And so, there may be an opportunity to sort of begin thinking about how to adapt these workers in the long term by virtue of the short and medium term issues that they're facing. But I think that's right, that that naturally there's going to be an emphasis on sort of putting out fires, as you put it. And I think in general, if we're thinking about the broader issue of just transition, then then almost any new job creation is a potential alternative for for those who work in the fossil fuel industry, depending on where the jobs get created.
Wonderful. So we are at the end of our time. There was one more question from Brooke Harris, who's asking about renewables and industrial production in India. And that's only one area where there is a clear need for additional technological improvement. That when we talk about renewables in India so far, we're mostly talking about electricity generation for the grid and not, for example, heat generation and areas like that for industrial use. So that's an area where there needs to be some more technological advance in our assessment. We are at the end of our time. Thanks so much, everybody, for attending. This was a terrific discussion. Really appreciate everybody taking the time to join Professor Blankenship and ISEP and Johns Hopkins SAIS for this discussion. Again, please do check out our website, sais-isep.org, for all of these activities. You will receive both this recording and the slides in email after this. Thank you very much for attending, and have a nice day. Look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye.
Yes, thank you, everyone.